Welcome to Francis Marion University's annual Constitution Day program. My name is David White, and I'm an associate professor of political science here at FMU. I'm here today to introduce our featured speaker, Dr. William Bolt. Dr. Bolt was born and raised in the great city of Buffalo, New York, where he also attended college, earning his BA degree in history and political science and MA degree in history from the University at Buffalo. He soon headed to Knoxville, where he earned his PhD in history from the University of Tennessee, writing his dissertation on the subject of the tariff in the age of Jackson. Before arriving at FMU, Dr. Bolt was an assistant editor with the James K. Polk Project, where he selected and edited documents for inclusion in volumes 10 and 11 of the series Correspondence of James K. Polk. He has been an instructor of history at Francis Marion University since 2009. At this point, I'd appreciate it if you could turn off your cell phones so we can be polite for Dr. Bolt. Dr. Bolt's talk today is titled James Madison versus John C. Calhoun, the Founding Father and the Rebellious Son. When he's finished today, he'll take some audience questions. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. William Bolt.
All right. Thank you, Professor White. Thank you, everyone, for coming out, taking some time out of your busy schedule. That's greatly appreciated. Well, the American people have been pioneers in so many fields since our country was established. When we look to athletics, agriculture, music, engineering, education, entrepreneurship, finance, theology, science, technology, in all of these areas, we can point to dozens, if not hundreds of Americans who have redefined these fields. One area where the United States is lacking is in political philosophers. In fact, the Parthenon of American political philosophers probably has only 3 members: John Adams, James Madison, and South Carolina's very own John C. Calhoun. This afternoon, as we commemorate Constitution Day, I'd like to discuss the constitutional thoughts of James Madison and John C. Calhoun. On 2 separate occasions, James Madison, the father of the Constitution, came into conflict with John C. Calhoun, a man who became a rebellious son. The ideological clashes between Madison and Calhoun over our Constitution have importance to us perhaps now more than ever. In an era where more and more Americans are re-examining and taking a renewed interest in their Constitution, the debates between Madison and Calhoun can teach us a great deal. Well, the first clash between our 2 greatest political philosophers occurred in 1817. The America of 1817 was still recovering from the effects of the War of 1812. In fact, Congress was holding sessions not in the Capitol, but rather in the Patent Office, because this was one of the few buildings in Washington City that the British had not put to the torch. Members of Congress in 1817 were obsessed, just like many members of Congress are today, with lowering the federal debt. However, the debt in 1817 was only $127 million. Although small by our contemporary standards, this debt alarmed many Americans and their elected representatives. To restore the economy, Congress slashed expenditures. It passed a bill increasing the tariff. Any foreign good entering the United States would now have to pay a duty or a tax of about 25%. And although now we live in an era of various free trade agreements, tariffs accounted for over 90% of the nation's revenue before the eruption of our Civil War. Congress also passed a bill chartering a new national bank. John C. Calhoun supported both of these bills in the House of Representatives, and President James Madison signed all of these economic recovery measures into law. Under the Act of Incorporation for this new national bank, the bank would pay the federal government a bonus of $1.5 million every year. What should be done with this bonus? John C. Calhoun proposed that the federal government use that bonus to fund internal improvements in the country. And Americans at this time understood internal improvements to mean roads, turnpikes, bridges, and canals. A national system of roads and canals would facilitate commerce throughout the entire nation. To the hawkish members of Congress, Calhoun argued that this national system would allow the Army to move from one part of the country to another with more speed. And Calhoun did not need to remind anyone that the British had marched into an undefended Washington city because troops in Baltimore couldn't get to the threatened area in time. Good roads would have saved the capital from destruction, according to Calhoun. A national system of roads and canals financed by the federal government would bind the country together, Calhoun said, and it would allow the American people to conquer space. Strict constructionists opposed this plan of Calhoun's. These men had already swallowed a protective tariff and a national bank. Calhoun's program of federally sponsored internal improvements seemed to encroach on the rights reserved to the states under the Constitution. For strict constructionists, Calhoun's ambitious plan seemed too similar to the plans of Alexander Hamilton. Where in the Constitution was Congress given the authority to appropriate funds for internal improvements? They asked the young Carolinian. Calhoun responded to these critics by arguing that projects such as these were too grand for state and local governments to accomplish. Only the federal government could finance and maintain roads that stretched from New Hampshire to Georgia. Calhoun tackled the constitutional question by arguing that Congress had the power to appropriate funds for internal improvements based on the preamble to provide for the common defense and promote the general welfare. Also, the third part of Article 1, Section 8, gives Congress the power to regulate commerce among the states. Calhoun also pointed to the final clause of Article 1, Section 8, which said that Congress has the authority to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper. Calhoun reminded his audience that Congress had approved numerous bills in the past by extending the enumerated powers. Congress had chartered 2 national banks. The Constitution says nothing about a national bank, but it does allow Congress to coin and regulate the value of money. Calhoun next referred to the United States Military Academy at West Point, which had been established in 1802. Again, under the Constitution, Congress could raise an army, but the document says nothing about a military school. Calhoun tried to seal his argument by noting the Louisiana Purchase. Where was this power? He asked his audience, the other members of Congress. In words that Calhoun would take back a decade later, Calhoun said that he was, quote, no advocate for refined arguments on the Constitution. The instrument was not intended as a thesis for the logician to exercise his ingenuity upon. It ought to be construed with plain good sense. If Congress had approved questionable bills by extending the Constitution on previous occasions, Calhoun argued, it could certainly do so again. At the Executive Mansion, President James Madison had been watching the progress of the bonus bill through Congress. He discussed the bill with former President Thomas Jefferson. Madison said that the bonus bill was of a very extraordinary character, but Madison expected that either the House or the Senate, one of the 2 branches, would reject the bonus bill. Well, the House approved Calhoun's bonus bill by a close vote of 86 to 84. It then cleared the Senate by a vote of 20 to 15, and then landed on James Madison's desk, just as he was set to leave the presidency. On March 2, 1817, just 2 days before Madison would leave the presidency, Calhoun and Henry Clay, the powerful Speaker of the House of Representatives, went to the executive mansion to pay a courtesy call on Madison. After the two congressmen congratulated Madison on his presidency, and as they wished him a safe and prosperous retirement, Madison informed them that he intended to veto the bonus bill. Clay and Calhoun were stunned. Clay said that the only thing that would have surprised him more than this veto was if an earthquake had swallowed up all of the federal capital. Both men asked Madison to reconsider, but Madison refused. The bonus bill would be vetoed. The next day, Madison delivered his veto message to Congress. Madison believed that the Constitution did not allow for Congress to appropriate funds for a general program of internal improvements. If this bill became law, Madison announced, the federal government would be supreme over the states. This in turn would only lead to the consolidation of more powers by the federal government. Madison announced that he knew of the importance of roads and canals for the country, but the Constitution did not give Congress the power to appropriate money on them. Madison concluded his veto message by saying that Congress could appropriate funds for internal improvements only if it went out and secured the approval and the ratification of a constitutional amendment. Strict constructionists praised this veto of James Madison, and for them, Madison's stance reminded them of the Madison of the early 1790s, when Madison had led the opposition to the programs of Alexander Hamilton. One editor wrote, quote, "The message of James Madison has saved the Constitution from violation, and the rights of the states are yet safe." Madison's veto of the bonus bill was perhaps the most important use of the veto power by a president until Andrew Jackson came into office. The veto of the bonus bill set a precedent for the nation. Roads, bridges, canals, and turnpikes would have to be constructed not by the federal government, but rather by state and local governments. This precedent would hold until the Civil War era and the railroad boom, and would not be fully overturned until we had the Federal Highway Act of 1956. Madison retired to his home of Montpelier in Virginia and stayed out of politics for the next decade. Calhoun resigned his House seat, accepted the position of Secretary of War under President James Monroe, and then became Vice President in 1825. During this so-called era of good feelings, the Jeffersonians, which were the only political party operating at the national level, continued to break away from their strict constructionist moorings. A new world has come into being since the Constitution was adopted, Henry Clay acknowledged in 1824, are the narrow, limited necessities of the old 13 states as they existed at the formation of the present Constitution forever to remain the rule of interpretation. Clay was, of course, advocating an energetic and a bold federal government. Nor was the Speaker alone in his calls for increasing the power of the federal government. From the bench, Chief Justice John Marshall handed down a series of decisions in the 1820s that augmented the powers of the federal government. Finally, in 1825, President John Quincy Adams, who entered the presidency through what Andrew Jackson called bargain and corruption, announced that he would be willing to put the nationalist agenda into operation. Adams recommended that Congress pass bills for internal improvements, that it create a national university, and that it establish a national observatory. To finance these lofty and grand schemes, Adams urged Congress to increase the tariff. Perhaps most galling to the American people, though, President Adams said that members of Congress should, quote, not be palsied by the whims of their constituents. In other words, elected officials should do what they thought was right, not what the people elected them thought might be correct. In particular, John C. Calhoun was alarmed at the accumulation of powers by the federal government. The protective tariff policy bothered Calhoun the most. High tariffs benefited northern manufacturers and hurt southern planters. High tariffs gave northern manufacturers a monopoly over the market, and with this monopoly, they could charge whatever price they wanted. Calhoun feared that the British would respond to American tariffs by instituting their own tariffs against American cotton, and this policy would, of course, destroy southern planters. In 1828, Congress passed what came to be known as the Tariff of Abominations, and Southerners argued that this high tariff was oppressive and that it taxed the people of the South at a higher rate than the people of the North. One South Carolinian announced that for every 100 bales of cotton that a Southern farmer cultivated, the tariff took away 40 bales. It's bad economics, but brilliant propaganda. South Carolinians began discussing ways to combat the accumulation of powers by the federal government. Naturally, they solicited John C. Calhoun's advice. Calhoun responded with the South Carolina Exposition. And in this document, Calhoun argued that Congress could pass a tariff only to raise revenue, not to protect manufacturers. Any tariff passed for protection and not revenue, according to Calhoun, was unconstitutional. To protect itself against violations of the Constitution by the federal government, Calhoun said that a state could nullify an act of Congress. Once a law was nullified, it would be null and void or of no force within a state's borders. Calhoun maintained that this was not a new idea. The theory of nullification could be found in the Virginia and the Kentucky resolutions, which were authored by James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, respectively, back in 1798. But at the heart of Calhoun's South Carolina exposition was his fear of the power of an unchecked majority. The northern majority, in Calhoun's eyes, had saddled the country with tariffs and high taxes. In the future, this majority might decide to abolish slavery. So while most Americans were championing the idea of majority rule, Calhoun and his allies in South Carolina were not. In the South Carolina Exposition, Calhoun stated, quote, "No government based on the principle that the majority ought to govern ever preserved its liberty even for a single generation." For Calhoun, the Constitution imposed limits and restrictions on the majority in Congress. He also added, "An unchecked majority is despotism." The Constitution, though, says nothing about nullification. Calhoun, though, believed that the 10th Amendment gave states the authority to nullify acts of Congress. And the 10th Amendment says, "Powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people." Calhoun also argued that no state would have ever entered the Union if it did not reserve the right to protect its sovereignty from encroachments by the federal government. When the states ratified the Constitution in 1787 and into 1788, Calhoun announced, they took it for granted that in collisions between the federal and state governments, the states would be allowed to protect themselves from the will of the unchecked majority through nullification. The Constitution, Calhoun noted, is a contract in which the states have appeared as sovereigns. Every time that a contract intervenes between parties that do not acknowledge a common arbiter, each of them retains the right to judge by itself the extent of its obligation. Calhoun called nullification the great conservative principle of our system because it would protect the rights of the minority from majority tyranny. And for Calhoun, nullification works similar to the amending process. If a state believed a federal law violated the Constitution, a state legislature, through a 2/3 vote of both chambers, could call for a special convention. And the convention apparatus was key for Calhoun because this is how the states had originally ratified the Constitution. If the convention agreed that the law violated the Constitution, then the law was nullified within the state. This would trigger the next phase of Calhoun's idea of nullification. The rest of the states, or the other members of the Constitutional Compact, would have to hold conventions to decide on the constitutionality of the disputed law. If 3/4 of the states, the same threshold to approve a constitutional amendment, said that the disputed law was constitutional, the nullifying state could accept this decision as final, or, and this became the key part of nullification for Calhoun, the state could secede from the Union. Calhoun argued that the remedy of nullification would only be used in the most extreme cases and that it would be a peaceful recourse. His critics disagreed. They charged that every action of Congress would be nullified and that the states would be constantly forced to hold conventions on disputed laws. Calhoun's opponents said that nullification took the teeth out of the federal government. Well, it was this idea of secession which captured the attention of the nation. And one man that did not agree with nullification was new President Andrew Jackson. Jackson had won the presidency in 1828 on a campaign of states' rights, retrenchment, and limited government. Nullifiers such as Calhoun expected Jackson to side with them. President Jackson, however, did not believe in nullification. Nullification is secession, Jackson roared, and secession is treason. In April 1830, political leaders gathered to commemorate Thomas Jefferson's birthday. For nullifiers in South Carolina, Jefferson's Kentucky resolutions seemed to sanction nullification, so they planned to use his birthday to extol the virtues of nullification. After a few toasts, President Andrew Jackson could stand no more. Jackson stood up, raised his glass, looked directly at Vice President Calhoun, and said, "Our federal union, it must be preserved." John C. Calhoun, not to be outdone, responded with, "Our federal union, next to our liberty, most dear." So Jackson was saying that the union had to be maintained and preserved at all costs. The union of the states trumped everything else. For John C. Calhoun, a union that threatened the liberties of the people was a union that wasn't worth preserving. Needless to say, at this juncture, President Jackson and Vice President Calhoun essentially defriended one another on Facebook, to put it in 21st century terms. The actions of South Carolina, though, also spurred former President James Madison into action as well. Madison said that nullification was preposterous and that would only lead to anarchy. Madison pointed to Article 6 of the Constitution, which declares, "This Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, shall be the supreme law of the land." The former president criticized nullifiers such as Calhoun for misconstruing the Virginia and the Kentucky resolutions. These documents did not condone what Madison called the twin heresies of nullification and secession. Rather, the resolutions of 1798 were written to defend civil liberties and to help the Jeffersonians win in the elections of 1798 and 1800. If nullification went into effect, Madison warned, it would lead to, quote, "a rupture of the Union, a Southern Confederacy, border wars, rival alliances abroad, standing armies at home, and worse yet, federal governments with even more powers than they already possessed. So for President James Madison, the remedy of nullification was worse than the disease. Madison's best description of nullification went as follows. Nullification has the effect of putting powder under the Constitution and the Union, and a match in the hand of every party to blow them up at pleasure. Madison expressed his views to both the nullifiers and their opponents. In a letter to South Carolina's Robert Hayne, Madison criticized nullification with increased venom. This letter was published, and now every American was able to see that the father of the Constitution was opposed to nullification. Former President James Madison believed that in a dispute between a state and the federal government, the proper arbiter was the Supreme Court. And Madison told the nullifiers to re-examine Federalist 39, which argued that in clashes between the national and state governments, the proper judge under the Constitution would be the Supreme Court. If the Constitution did not provide for the supremacy of the federal courts, Madison observed, it would be, quote, as much a mockery as a scabbard put into the hand of a soldier without a sword in it. If state governments had the power to decide the constitutionality of disputed laws in the United States, Madison reasoned, it would be like going back to the government under the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union, which had created a weak national government with no powers to enforce its laws. While Madison, the nullifiers, and many Americans engaged in a pitched battle about the powers of the federal government and questions regarding sovereignty, the nullifiers and Calhoun took their case to the people of the Palmetto State. Orators took to the stump and discussed nullification. Repeal the tariff or repeal the Union, they insisted. In the October elections of 1832, the nullifiers won control of the South Carolina legislature and hastily called a convention. On November 24th, 1832, the nullifiers declared that the tariffs of the United States were null and void within the state of South Carolina. They also called for the raising of a 12,000-member state militia to protect the state in case Jackson sent federal troops to the state. These events of November 1832 had sparked the greatest constitutional crisis probably up until we arrive at the secession crisis of 1860-1861. When President Andrew Jackson learned of the events in South Carolina, he exploded with rage. Jackson vowed that the laws of the land would be enforced. A single state telling the other 24 what was constitutional was lunacy and a threat to democracy. If South Carolina succeeded with nullification, this would end majority rule. To visitors, members of Congress, and diplomats, Jackson talked openly of hanging his own vice president, John C. Calhoun, for treason. And when you have the president talking openly of hanging his own vice president, I think it's safe to say you have a bit of a constitutional crisis on your hands. In South Carolina, volunteer militia companies began to drill in the streets of Charleston, Columbia, and other cities. Orators vowed that South Carolina would become the graveyard of freemen rather than the habitat of men and women deprived of their liberty. The excitement galvanized the women of South Carolina as well. Even the women would shoot President Jackson, a nullifier noted, for they are as strong nullifiers as any, and in some cases urge their husbands and sons to revolution. As a Yankee who married a South Carolina girl, I can certainly attest to that last statement. Jackson issued a proclamation to the people of South Carolina on December 10th, 1832. In this document, Jackson argued that the Union had preceded the states and that the Union had come about in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence, not in 1787 with the Constitution. Jackson said the Constitution of the United States forms a government, not a league, and whether it be formed by compact between the states or in any other manner, its character is the same. It is a government which all the people are represented, which operates directly on people individually and not on the states. Therefore, at least according to Jackson's interpretation of the Constitution, a state could not nullify a federal law, nor could it secede at its own pleasure. Jackson's nationalist interpretation of the Union naturally appalled the nullifiers. One nullifier said that Jackson's proclamation was just the type of paper that Alexander Hamilton would have written and that Thomas Jefferson would have condemned. Jackson's proclamation, a critical state paper and a key document in what historians refer to as Jacksonian democracy, contained many of the ideas of former President James Madison. In fact, when Jackson first delivered this proclamation, numerous Americans, both North and South, believed that Madison was in fact the true author of this nullification proclamation. While we know that Madison was not in Washington City at the time, we do know that James Madison carried on an extensive correspondence with a man by the name of Nicholas Trist during the nullification crisis. Nicholas Trist, at this time, he served as the personal secretary to Andrew Jackson. So through this back-channel intermediary, James Madison provided Andrew Jackson with constitutional ammunition to hurl back at the nullifiers in South Carolina. The nullifiers announced, though, that nullification would go into effect on March 4th, 1833. And this gave Congress one last chance to try and broker a compromise. Finding a compromise solution would be very difficult, since the nullifiers were demanding a complete abandonment of the protective tariff system. If Congress slashed all tariffs, Northern manufacturers would be ruined by their British counterparts. Senator Henry Clay of Kentucky came forward with a potential compromise. And Clay proposed the tariff system would be lowered, but it would be lowered gradually over 10 years. The sharpest reductions to the tariff would occur both in 1840 and 1841. This would give Northern manufacturers a decade to prepare for competition against foreign imports. The only problem with Senator Henry Clay's plan was that the Constitution says that all revenue bills must originate in the House of Representatives, not in the Senate, where Clay was planning on introducing it. And of course, in the House, Northerners, the supporters of the protective policy, they had a large majority. And the Northern tariff men did not want to surrender the tariff, nor did they want to establish a precedent where a small minority could tell a majority what it could and couldn't do. These Northern tariff men, though, perhaps came to their senses and told Clay that they would swallow his bill to reduce the tariff over 10 years, but they wanted a bill of their own giving increased powers to the president. What came out of this agreement was the Revenue Enforcement Act. This bill gave the president to close off an American port or harbor if he wanted to. It allowed him to remove custom houses to an unthreatened location or even to vessels at sea. This bill removed ambiguities and clothed the president with additional powers to make sure that the laws of the land were enforced. When news of this force bill arrived in South Carolina, nullifiers cried foul. They argued this measure gave the president powers to end American democracy, and some even noted that Jackson would soon be crossing the Rubicon. Jackson, or a future president, using the authority granted to him under the force bill, might end the republic and install a military despotism in its place. Calhoun and the Senate said the force bill did away with the government that the founding fathers had bequeathed to the future generations and replaced it with a government of the sword. To show their discontent, the nullifiers called the force bill the bloody bill, the bill to repeal the Constitution, and my favorite, the Botany Bay Bill. Faced with a president bent on vengeance, the nullifiers rescinded their ordinance of nullification and accepted the compromise as proposed by Congress. In a face-saving gesture, the nullifiers nullified the force bill. Civil war, at least in 1833, had been averted. As the dust settled from the nullification crisis, Americans took stock of just how close the country had come to civil war. Calhoun could claim that nullification had succeeded because it had forced a lowering of the tariff. However, the position of Jackson and the arguments against nullification presented by President Madison discouraged other states from officially declaring federal laws null and void, although we could certainly argue that numerous states have ignored or refrained from enforcing federal laws at various times in our nation's history. If we are to say that Calhoun and the nullifiers emerged victorious, we would have to call it a hollow victory for sure. Madison, although he was too old to take a victory lap, Madison noted with pleasure on the success of the cause of the Union and believed that the idea of secession had been quashed forever. James Madison only lived for 3 more years after the crisis was resolved. In 1836, the father of the Constitution passed away. The question now became, what was to be done with President Madison's papers? These would, of course, be a treasure trove to researchers because Madison's papers included all of his notes on the Constitutional Convention, which had not yet been published. In 1837, a bill was introduced proposing to have Congress purchase Madison's papers. What better way to honor the father of the Constitution? From the back of the chamber, though, John C. Calhoun stood up and announced his opposition to this plan. Calhoun asked the supporters of this bill, where was Congress given the authority to purchase a president's papers? What clause gave Congress this power? Calhoun next told Congress that when he first entered Congress, he favored an interpretation which gave Congress and the federal government a great amount of powers over the state and the local governments. But Calhoun said that his opinions had undergone a great change over the years, and the man most responsible for that change was, of course, James Madison. We should not honor the father of the Constitution by doing something unconstitutional in his name, Calhoun announced. Numerous senators criticized Calhoun for an over-strict interpretation of the powers of Congress. A few even argued that Calhoun was trying to avenge old defeats at the hands of a deceased patriot. Calhoun's opposition, though, clearly reveals that he had not forgotten about the stinging defeats which he had incurred at the hands of President James Madison. Nonetheless, the measure cleared the Senate, but Calhoun was able to convince 13 other senators to vote against the purchase of Madison's papers. Madison's constitutional philosophy and his unionism prevented the Union from being stretched to death in 1817, and it prevented the Union from being torn to pieces in 1833. During his 2 engagements with Calhoun, Madison responded in a manner befitting his title, the Father of the Constitution. Why are these clashes, which are close to 200 years old, why are they important today? Well, we have always had discussions about the powers of the federal government and the reserved rights of the states. We are still having sometimes rancorous debates regarding federal spending. Recently, however, the idea of nullification has resurfaced in the United States. Neo-nullifiers have contended that states, as members of the Constitutional Compact, can nullify actions of the federal government. 9 states, Alabama, Idaho, Kansas, Maine, Missouri, Oregon, Nebraska, Texas, and Wyoming have all discussed the idea of nullifying recent actions by the federal government. Thomas Woods, the intellectual leader of this movement, writes, "Nullification is a principle that defends the freedom of all Americans who are equally threatened by a government that acts without limits." If Calhoun was alive today, he no doubt would agree with what Mr. Woods has written. Perhaps these recent actions and this talk of nullification are idle threats. Perhaps they are not. After the people of the United States rejected nullification as a viable constitutional option in 1833, James Madison wrote, "The coming generation will look back with astonishment at the infatuation which could produce this present state of things." Well, unfortunately for Madison, nullification is once again being celebrated in the United States. If states make good on their threats, we may be plunged back into another nullification crisis, and we may need once again to look at the arguments and the philosophies of James Madison, the father of our great Constitution. Thank you very much for your time and attention.